Thank you, Itamar and Uzi. It's an honor to have been asked to deliver this lecture. There are others in this university and in this country who are as qualified as I am to deliver it, and at the head of that list would be Itamar Rabinovich. It was Itamar who brought Lewis to Tel Aviv University year after year, and who introduced a generation of Israeli students, and some of us are here, to Lewis's work. I first heard of Lewis when I was 18. That was 50 years ago, on day one of my study of the Middle East in the classroom of the 30-year-old Dr. Itamar Rabinovich. There at the top of the syllabus was Lewis's minor masterpiece, The Middle East and the West. I still have my worn copy of that book. The job of a teacher, first-year students, is to map the field for them, and Itamar put Lewis at the center of my map. I then went on to Princeton, and by one of those unlikely coincidences, Lewis joined the faculty a couple of years later, and that began my own relationship with Lewis as his student and as his friend that lasted for more than 40 years. But it was Itamar who showed the way to Lewis, and that was just one of his many gifts to me and to this university and to Israel. Now, anyone who knew Lewis at some point discovered that he moved in many different circles. If you belong to his large Princeton circle, you'd be surprised to discover that he had an equally large circle in Washington. If you thought he really belonged to Tel Aviv, you'd be surprised to discover the extent of his network in Jerusalem. And if you thought he had no more friends than in Israel, you'd be astonished to learn how many he had in Turkey. Lewis stood at the center of many large circles, which he compartmentalized. And perhaps the most compartmentalized of those worlds was the political one. Lewis had a very public presence in the university and on the lecture circuit, and later in the media. He left a very thick paper trail. But he also had a variety of interactions with the political world, for which the paper trail was actually very, very thin. And indeed, had he not published his memoirs very late in life, many of these interactions would have been lost to history forever. In his political circle, Lewis practiced discretion. And this was no more so than in his meetings and interactions with political leaders. Now, the relationship with philosophers and kings is a fraught one. The philosopher's mission is to pursue the truth. The king's purpose is to wield power. Sometimes these conflicting missions set philosophers and kings on a collision course, but not always. In many instances, a kind of negotiation ensues. The philosopher may seek to persuade the king to follow a certain path, and to do so he must show sympathy. The king may seek to persuade the philosopher to justify a policy. To succeed, he has to be prepared to listen. When the philosopher and the king belong to different countries or civilizations, the philosopher may play yet another role as an intermediary, transmitting and translating messages between kings or presidents or prime ministers. Now, for the philosopher, and he could be a political scientist or a historian or an economist, all these activities are far removed from his primary mission. Research and writing are solitary pursuits, best accomplished away from the struggle over worldly power and position. And Bernard Lewis certainly spent much of his time in scholarly solitude. His books fill an entire shelf in the section on the history of Islam in the Middle East. And had he done only this, we would remember him still. But Lewis did more. He found the time and showed the inclination to engage with the world of politics. Let me quote him. I had occasional encounters with the historic process through meetings which made policy. Over the years in my innumerable visits to the Middle East, I had meetings with kings, presidents, prime ministers, other high officials, as well as with ambassadors of different states. We talked of various things. From time to time, I gave my opinions, sometimes in response to a request, and sometimes not. So what I propose to do this evening is to flesh out the bare bones of this statement, to name some of the kings and presidents, prime ministers, other high officials, to reconstruct a few of Lewis's interactions with them and put them in context, and finally to ask whether they made any difference, and if so, how. And one caveat, this is a very preliminary exploration. To fill it out, I need to interview many more living people. So until I do, please regard this as a work in progress. So let me begin at the beginning. Vernon Lewis was born in London in 1916 to Jewish parents. He quickly showed an aptitude for languages and promise as a historian. In 1939, he completed a doctorate in Islamic history at the University of London. He was only 23 years old. During the Second World War, he served in British intelligence in London. Most of his work seems to have been pretty mundane, translating intercepted signals in traffic from languages in which he had the proficiency of a prodigy. In his memoirs, he records this: "The great tragedy of my life during the war was that on the one occasion, the only occasion, when the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, visited my unit, by sheer bad luck, I was on leave. I thus lost my only opportunity to meet Winston Churchill." Now, one can empathize with a young historian, not yet 30, who learns he's just missed his chance to meet not just a British Prime Minister, but a man who was turning the course of world history. But I think the passage reveals something deeper. Lewis wrote, "I thus lost my only opportunity to meet Winston Churchill." Now, why should that have been so? Churchill had at least another 20 years to run. He did another second stint as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, and he passed away only in 1965. By that time, Lewis was just shy of the age of 50. Couldn't Lewis have met Churchill at some time later, after the war? The answer to that question is not likely. Lewis in those years was a professor at the University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, specializing in pre-modern Islamic history. He didn't move in the right circles, and the British establishment seems to have taken very scant interest in him. Britain had run an empire in the Islamic East long before Lewis's grandparents had left Eastern Europe for the East End of London. They'd governed Arabia and Persia, Egypt and Iraq, Palestine and Afghanistan. Britain was full of these sun-beaten old hands, right? Experts on everything, Arab and Islamic, who met every possible need of the British government. So not only did Lewis not meet Churchill, I can't find a record of him meeting any British Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary. He traded views. He had a friend in the Foreign Office with whom he shared a teacher, and that was about as high as he reached. It was probably this friend who scored Lewis an invite to a royal luncheon at Buckingham Palace around 1968 in honor of ruling sheikhs from the Arab Gulf. They were about to separate from Britain. As Lewis put it, "The guest lists grew longer and longer and even reached my level." Right? He met the Queen, and Prince Philip summoned him to translate something one of the sheikhs said in conversation. As Lewis later recalled, "The sheikh put his point to me in Arabic, and fortunately I was able to understand it and repeat it in English. A moment of immense pride, but unfortunately I haven't the slightest recollection of what it was about." And this, he notes, was his one and only entry to the palace. So Lewis was far down the social register in the land of his birth. I mean, his reputation grew in scholarly circles. In 1963, he was elected to the British Academy. But when it came to politics, access to the highest echelons depended largely on pedigree, Oxbridge schooling, and old boy connections. And Lewis just didn't have them. Now, two developments would change that for Lewis and open doors. One had to do with his students from the mid-60s, and the second, his move to America in the mid-70s. First, the students. The School of Oriental and African Studies, and you see the academic staff in 1953, all men, of course, was a magnet for students from the Middle East, especially from the ruling elites. Those who studied under Lewis in the 50s went home, and they gained influence and spread news of his genius. They also considered him sympathetic to them and to their aspirations. Now, after the Suez debacle, 1956, many of those old hands that I mentioned were no longer welcome in the East. countries had won their independence. The nationalist mood in Asia and Africa was good riddance to the empire and to those who had served it. Now, Lewis, for one, hadn't been a part of it. As he wrote, and I quote him, "Although my career in England covered the last years of the breakup of the British Empire, I was never part of the imperial service. And even my wartime role in British intelligence was concerned with preventing Axis penetration rather than preserving British domination." So now that domination had vanished. And he didn't mourn its passing. In his Middle East and the West, published in 1964, he wrote, and I quote him, "There is little that can be said in defense of the so-called imperialism encountered by the Middle East in the first half of the 20th century, an imperialism of interference without responsibility, which would neither create nor permit stable and orderly government." End of quote. So all this meant that when Lewis traveled the world, he could rely on a growing number of faithful former students who were proud to introduce him to their national leaders as a friend of their aspirations. Now here's one illustration. In the early 70s, he had a layover in Singapore on a flight to Australia. He contacted a former student, and he tells the story in these words. "On the day of my arrival, he picked me up, took me to the hotel and said, 'Oh, by the way, you have an appointment at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with the Prime Minister, Kuan Yew.' Kuan Yew was the founder of modern Singapore. You can imagine that I was more than a little startled. I asked, 'But why?' 'We thought he'd be interested to meet you.' And we asked him, and he was. The next morning, with some apprehension, I turned up at Kuan Yew's office at 10 o'clock. Now, Kuan Yew wanted to know why Muslims in Singapore, as he put it, kept sinking to the bottom of the pile. Why are they like that? And what can we do about it? Lewis recalled, "I provided an inadequate answer to the first question and none at all to the second." Now, this was an insignificant exchange, but it demonstrates the point. Lewis's former student, obviously highly placed, opened the door for him at the top. And this became a pattern. His students and disciples turned into his ambassadors, and they secured him political access that no British ambassador secured for him. Second, the move to America. The move didn't happen in one fell swoop. It evolved over 2 decades. Lewis had taken up several visiting academic positions in America beginning in the 1950s. Over the years, and from time to time, he came to Washington to lecture. In about 1969, a young man named Richard Pearl heard him speak in Washington. Pearl was working at the time for Henry Scoop Jackson. He's over here on the left, Democratic senator from Washington State, and a formidable figure in foreign policy debates. Jackson was strongly anti-communist, an opponent of détente with the Soviet Union, and a staunch supporter of Israel. I very recently asked Pearl about it, and this is how he tells the story. "I went into Scoop's office the next morning and I said, 'I just heard the most extraordinary lecture last night by a professor named Lewis, who was erudite, articulate, and spoke not only in sentences and paragraphs, but in pages. You've got to meet him.' Pearl arranged for Jackson to lunch with Lewis in the Senate dining room, and the two men immediately hit it off. You see them together here. And from then on, Lewis became Jackson's muse and sounding board on the Middle East. As Jackson's biographer put it, Lewis provided the view of a preeminent historian, which helped inoculate Jackson to the claim that he was running against expert opinion. Now, as early as 1971, Lewis began testifying before Jackson's Senate subcommittee on topics as varied as Soviet activities in the Middle East, Egyptian intentions, and Israeli politics. Jackson's wife later described Lewis in these words: "Bernard Lewis was one of the few in the academic world with whom Scoop consulted regularly over the years. He had confidence in the professor's judgment. Scoop knew he could depend on Professor Lewis for sophisticated analysis and far-reaching understanding of the developments in the Arab world." So when Lewis landed permanently in Princeton in 1975, Washington was already open to him. Lewis was nearly 60 when he made the move. He only became a naturalized American at the age of 66 in 1982. But well before that, when he offered his take on what America should do in the world, Americans regarded him as one of us. In his adopted land, not only did he finally escape the limits of class, he discovered that being foreign was no barrier either. And he wrote this: "Striking was the acceptance in the United States of the newcomer, which in England would have been inconceivable. Such figures as Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski would have been, and indeed probably still are, impossible in Britain." And indeed, from Kissinger to Brzezinski, from Madeleine Albright to Samantha Power, Washington has always opened space for foreign-born immigrants at the top of the foreign policy establishment, and it opened space for Lewis too. Now, in one sense, the Jackson, and here, by the way, is Lewis and Kissinger in an event that Tel Aviv University organized for him. You were there, and so were you. You organized it, in fact. Now, in one sense, the Jackson connection was a dead end. Jackson ran twice for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972 and 1976. He lost both times. In 1983, while still a senator, he died of an aneurysm at only 71 years of age. But although Scoop was gone, Lewis had become an intellectual guide to Scoop's aides, to Pearl, who I mentioned, and also to Paul Wolfowitz. They had long Washington careers ahead of them, and they would be crucial in bringing Lewis into the inner circle and finally into the White House, as we'll see. So I provided the context, and in the time that remains, I want to explore several instances of Lewis's interactions with Middle Eastern leaders. This will take us to Cairo and Jerusalem, Tehran and Ankara, Amman and Baghdad. Then we'll circle back to Washington, where Lewis had his breakthrough to the top. And finally, we'll make two last stops in Libya and Tripoli and in Jerusalem, and I'll offer an overall assessment. I know you have to leave at some point. So. The first is the case of Lewis as a messenger. It's a story of Lewis and Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel from 1969 to 1974. Now, Lewis was a frequent visitor to Israel. He would come to know the gamut of Israel's leaders from his own generation and younger, and they included Abba Eban, whom he knew from his early years, Moshe Dayan, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Ehud Barak, and Benjamin Netanyahu. But aside from Eban, Meir was the first, and Lewis came to her as a man on a mission. In 1969, Lewis visited Egypt to attend a conference. Nasser was still in power. Egypt was smarting after its defeat 2 years earlier. Lewis briefly met Nasser, but they didn't have a conversation. Still, he recalled, and I quote him, "I saw a lot of people, including very old friends, and I was struck by the change in mood. I came away with a very clear impression that Egypt was ready for peace. I was sure of it. I had no doubts whatsoever." And over the next 2 years, Lewis became more persuaded. He returned to Cairo in 1970. 1971, by then Nasser had died. He didn't meet Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, but he met his advisors, and he became, as he put it, convinced that a direct approach to Egypt would produce results. In 1971, he said the same thing in Senate testimony. This is 1971, and listen to what Lewis said. "I am quite convinced that there is in Egypt a genuine desire for peace. I have no doubt about that at all. It was there before the death of Nasser, and it has become more open since the death of Nasser." End of quote. And in fact, this wasn't just a desire in Egypt. Sadat's advisor, Tahsin Bashir, seems to have asked Lewis to convey to Golda Meir that Sadat wanted an interim agreement. But the Israelis weren't interested. On a visit to Israel, Golda Meir invited Lewis to her kitchen, where she prepared tea and cake for him. Lewis made the case, but Golda blew him off. And let's let Lewis tell that story. "I tried to convince her that the Egyptians were ready, that a direct approach would almost certainly produce results. She didn't believe me. She indicated that I had allowed myself to be duped by the Egyptians and that it was all nonsense. I tried the same with Moshe Dayan. I think he did believe me, but he didn't like it. He just didn't want to negotiate. I also put it to Rabin. I even wrote Rabin a letter to that effect. Did you find it ever? No. But it fell on deaf ears. They didn't want to believe me or didn't want to believe me. Now, this year we mark 50 years to the October 1973 Yom Kippur War. Was it all because Golda thought Lewis had been duped? Well, not really. There were many more missed signals in many more important channels, but it helps explain why those other messages got misplaced. There'd be another encounter with Golda Meir a few years later on the Palestinian question. In 1974, Lewis prepared a piece that would eventually be published by Commentary. under the title, The Palestinians and the PLO. Now, Lewis began by demonstrating how the concept of a Palestinian people arose only after the First World War. But he still urged Israel to test the willingness of the PLO to negotiate a two-state solution. And remember, this is a time when Israel regarded the PLO as a terrorist organization, which was totally beyond the pale. Golda distributed Lewis's article to the entire cabinet, and she summoned him to a meeting. And according to someone who was there, and I quote him, "They spoke for hours. Her aides tried to end it, but Golda kept going, and Bernard didn't want to be rude." But she was only interested in the historical point about the recent origins of the Palestinians. In 1969, she said that there was no such thing as the Palestinians, right, which was probably her most famous or infamous statement. And now she thought she'd found an academic authority to back her up. But she completely ignored Lewis's suggestion about the PLO. Lewis later identified what he thought was Meir's problem. He admitted that she was tough. But in his view, and I quote, "Golda was fitted with a kind of personal filtration system. She only heard what she wanted to hear. If she picked up anything in what I was saying to her that fit within her pattern of thought, she would immediately grasp and use it. Anything that didn't fit just went straight past her." So Lewis's most sustained interaction with an Israeli leader didn't yield fruit. It wouldn't be the only time that a leader seized upon some part of Lewis's message to reinforce a preconceived notion. The next case is Lewis and the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah. Now, Lewis doesn't say when or where he first met the Shah, although he claimed to have known him quite well. In 1971, he received an invite to this big bash that the Shah was throwing in Persepolis to mark 2,500 years to the Iranian monarchy. Lewis recalled being delighted by the invitation. And at Persepolis, he was seated there with a global who's who. He saw the Shah summon the ghost of Cyrus. "O mighty Cyrus, you may sleep in peace, for we are awake." Lewis admired the Shah for taking up what he called the transformation of the Persians from a religious community to a secular nation. He didn't detect the resentment that the Shah was provoking. Now, in 1975, he wrote a prescient article and commentary entitled "The Return of Islam." Right? It's a classic. We all know it. He picked up tremors of Islamic protest in Egypt and in Syria and elsewhere. But nowhere did it mention Iran. A few years later, he would confess that he hadn't heard of Khomeini until everyone else did. In his memoirs, Lewis says the Shah received him in the royal palace in Tehran just a year before the revolution. The Shah immediately confronted him. "Why are Western newspapers attacking me?" Lewis reassured him. He said the West cared little for the friendship of any government that would seek our friendship. The West only catered to its enemies. Now, this may have been true to some extent, but it wasn't what the Shah needed to hear from a friend. The Shah had come under criticism not because of a general Western disdain for friends, but because of his own specific failings. So in short, Lewis didn't see the Iranian Revolution coming, but he understood before almost anyone the theocratic mindset of the regime that Khomeini founded. The third instance is the relationship between Lewis and Turgut Özal, who served as Prime Minister of Turkey from 1983 to 89, and then as President from 1989 to 93, which was a crucial decade in U.S.-Turkish relations. He's the fellow here on the far right. Now, Lewis had many friends in Turkey at the top. He'd been going to the country regularly since 1950. He knew Turkish well. Itamar mentioned his 1961 book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey. That established him as the foremost Western historian and friend of Turkey. And Ozal, in turn, was a great advocate of a strong Western and pro-American orientation for Turkey. Lewis relates that he first met Ozal in Princeton when Ozal was still a very minor parliamentarian. The two men clicked. Lewis and Ozal stayed in regular contact after Ozal rose to the top. This became useful in 1990, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. America agonized over the possible cost of going to war against Iraq. As we'll see shortly, Lewis had important contacts in the Pentagon who asked him how tough a nut were Saddam's forces. And Lewis told them that a war against Saddam would be quick, cheap, and easy. Talk about 1991. Now, how did he know? I quote Lewis, "I was echoing what President Ozil had told me shortly before when I was in Turkey on university business. Ozil and I spent an evening together. I knew him well, long before he rose to high office, and our conversation was more relaxed than it would be normal between a head of state and a visiting foreigner. And he said, there will be war, and when it comes, it will be quick, cheap, and easy." Ozil explained to him that Iraqi soldiers and officers were already deserting in droves to Turkey. Lewis relayed the word back to the Pentagon, and as Lewis noted, the results of the invasion amply confirmed President Ozil's judgment. You can go online and watch Ozil taking a victory lap in March of 1991 at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Ozil and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney are on the dais. You can see Cheney to Lewis's right and Ozil to his left. And Lewis is speaking. Vernon Lewis praises Ozil in these words. "I recall in a conversation which we had in Ankara in November that Ozil predicted with quite astonishing accuracy the likelihood of war, the duration of war, the cost, and the probable results. This wisdom and this foresight are rare, if not unique." Lewis is praising Ozil. Now, this set scene, Lewis poised between Ozil and Cheney. And the hint of Lewis on a secret mission sent Lewis's reputation as a key link between Washington and Ankara skyrocketing. Now, 2 years later, Ozil died suddenly at the age of 65 in suspicious circumstances. This didn't exhaust Lewis's connections at the top in Turkey. He had a long-standing friendship. I apologize for the quality of these photographs. A long-standing friendship with Suleiman Demirel, who succeeded Ozil as president. Now, I knew they were good friends. I personally went with Lewis in the mid-1990s to see Demirel at the presidential palace in Ankara. And this portly Demirel greeted him with wide open arms like an old buddy. But the 90s were a decade of polarization in Turkey between secularists and Islamists. And all of Lewis's friends were on the secular side of the order. And this bubbled up in a clash between Lewis and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Islamist who became Turkey's prime minister in 2003. In 2004, Lewis appeared with Erdogan on a panel in Chicago. And Lewis made a reference to Islamic terrorism. And Erdogan went after Lewis. I quote Erdogan, "This expression, Islamic terrorism, upsets Muslims. It is very ugly to associate terrorism with Islam. You can say religious terrorism, but you cannot say Islamic terrorism." And this was a cue for Erdogan's Islamist followers to attack Lewis, denouncing him as a Jew, and a Zionist, and a neocon, and an Islamophobe. And from then on, Lewis began to make dark prophecies about Turkey's retreat from the West and submission to Islamism. In 2011, he speculated that in 10 years, Turkey and Iran could switch places. And from that point, many Turks turned against him. In 2012, Erdogan rounded up a group of generals who had overthrown a previous Islamist government. Right? That overthrow became known as the postmodern coup. And in the revelations that followed, Lewis was exposed as an enabler of the coup in collusion with Washington neoconservatives and a prominent Turkish general. So that was a rather ignominious end to a long romance. Many Turks still revere Lewis. Search his name on Twitter any day to see Turks quoting and praising him. But well before Lewis died, Turkey had dropped from his travel itinerary. We now come to Jordan, where Lewis was a frequent and welcome guest. It began at a historians' conference held in Amman in 1974 under the auspices of Crown Prince Hassan, the brother of King Hussein. Now, at that time and for many years after, Hassan and Hussein were a royal tag team. They had saved their kingdom by expelling the PLO in 1970. But the fad among Western intellectuals was to be pro-Palestinian and to huddle with Yasser Arafat over in Beirut. So Hassan set out to win at least a few big names over to Jordan's cause. And Lewis, he was an obvious recruit. And this developed into what Lewis described as a personal relationship with the royal family. In his memoirs, he tells the story of attending a festive Bedouin reception for Hussein and Hassan out in the desert. And it's a very colorful tale. I commend it to you. It suggests the degree of intimacy that he enjoyed with Hassan, if not with Hussein. Now, of course, the Jordanians didn't need Lewis to serve as a messenger, either to the Americans or to the Israelis. But Hassan had these intellectual pretensions, and Lewis's friendship validated them. This is Asher. This is Hassan, right? That's how he's identified in the subtitle, not Hussein. Yeah. That looks like Hussein, although the caption that I saw said Hassan. King Hussein died in 1999, but at the last minute he replaced Hassan with his son Abdullah as heir to the throne. Lewis attended Hussein's funeral, but he clearly sympathized with Hassan and repeats Hassan's version of what happened in his memoirs. After Hassan's sidelining, Lewis made only one or two more visits to Jordan. I don't think he didn't record ever meeting the new king. But his relationship with Hassan had a very curious footnote. In 2003, after the US overthrew Saddam Hussein, Lewis co-authored an article with the former CIA director, James Woolsey. The article proposed the restoration of a constitutional monarchy in Iraq. And the authors didn't name Hassan, but they wrote that the monarch, quote, should be a Hashemite prince with political experience and no political obligations or commitments. Well, only Hassan fit that bill. And Woolsey, when asked, had no problem suggesting Hassan. The episode goes unmentioned in Lewis's memoirs. And one suspects his loyalty to Hassan was exploited in pursuit of somebody's far-fetched scheme. And in any case, Hassan disclaimed any interest in the Iraqi throne after all the last Hashemite who sat on one was butchered. And this, perhaps, not a good picture, is the opportunity to introduce Lewis's most significant and controversial relationship with a regional leader. That's the Iraqi exile politician and businessman, Ahmed Chalabi. It was Chalabi, as head of the exiled Iraqi National Congress, who persuaded the Bush administration that Iraq could be made a shining model of democracy if only the United States would topple Saddam Hussein. Now, Chalabi met Lewis in 1991. That is the first war, the Kuwait War, when Chalabi spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And there, Chalabi claimed it had been a terrible mistake to leave Saddam in power after driving him from Kuwait. Lewis came away impressed. Not only had he reached a similar conclusion, it probably helped that Chalabi was very suave and historically minded, Western educated, impeccably dressed. Lewis began to promote Chalabi to friends in Washington. Now, there are a couple of biographies of Chalabi, and Lewis appears in them primarily in connection with a Pentagon meeting organized by Richard Pearl 8 days after the 9/11 attacks. Two speakers addressed that group. Lewis opened with what Pearl called a brilliant presentation, which had everyone spellbound, and then came Chalabi, whom Lewis introduced as my friend. Lewis hadn't been to Iraq since the end of the World War, and Chalabi became his window on the country. And Lewis was so taken that he eventually advocated the US installing Chalabi as head of an interim Iraqi government in northern Iraq. Now, it's hard to describe the contours of this relationship because Lewis makes no mention of Chalabi at all in his memoirs. It's a striking omission, given that many saw Lewis as Chalabi's special champion. Now, after the war, Chalabi stood accused of fabricating reports about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps Lewis came to see the relationship as an embarrassment. Perhaps in this case, he did feel he'd been duped. Chalabi died in 2015 of a heart attack at the age of 71. So far, we've covered the early relationship with Scoop Jackson, Lewis's relations with Middle Eastern leaders, but these all pale in comparison with what would become his most significant relationship with the American Republican politician, Dick Cheney. Cheney served as defense secretary during the Kuwait War in 1991 and as vice president from 2001 to 2009, 2 terms. And that included 9/11 and the Iraq War. Cheney is commonly regarded as the most powerful vice president in American history, and Lewis had his ear. The relationship began in 1990. Cheney's wife, Lynn, knew Lewis well. She had chaired the National Endowment for the Humanities, which named Lewis the Jefferson Lecture in the spring of 1990, and that lecture appeared famously on the cover of the September issue of The Atlantic as The Roots of Muslim Rage. The issue hit the newsstands just as the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, and an internal White House memo shows that it was placed on the desk of President George H.W. Bush. The stars were aligning. Lewis's friends who had worked for Scoop Jackson had crossed the aisle to the Republican side. and had become officials or advisors in the Pentagon. With the Middle East on page 1, Lewis became the man of the hour, and his friends introduced him to Cheney. Cheney told the story in a later tribute to Lewis, and let me quote him. This is Cheney speaking. "Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and we brought in a large number of outside experts to speak about the way forward in the Middle East. I got a wide range of advice, some of it very good, some of it terrible. No one offered sounder analysis or better insight than Bernard Lewis. He was an absolute standout, and I decided that day that this was a man I wanted to keep in touch with. Since then, we have met often. He is always objective, thoroughly candid, and completely independent. These, combined with the depth of his knowledge, make Bernard the very ideal of the wise man." Now, this admiration was mutual. Listen to Lewis, and I quote him. "I found Cheney to be thoughtful and unusual among politicians in that he wanted to hear what I had to say. He asked excellent questions, listened intently to my answers, and asked probing follow-ups." Now, it's very interesting to ask why Cheney called in a large number of experts in the first place. Lewis also recalled that almost every Middle East expert in the country was invited to Washington. Now, remember, the defense secretary commands immense resources within the government. So why go outside? In the case of Cheney, one possibility can't be dismissed. It's that Cheney knew what he wanted to do, but faced opposition within the administration and the Pentagon. So he canvassed outside experts for reinforcement. Now, this isn't to say that he didn't listen and learn, as Lewis attests that he did. But Cheney found in Lewis someone whom he could quote and invoke in support of his own preferences. And Cheney preferred that America lean into the Middle East. Now, the real peak in the relationship followed the 9/11 attacks on 2001. By this time, Cheney was vice president, a man of deep national security experience compared to the new president, the son, George W. Bush. And this advantage gave Cheney a dominant role in crafting initial U.S. response to 9/11, including the decision to invade Iraq. And the weeks after 9/11, Lewis received many invitations in official Washington. He had dinner twice with Cheney at the vice presidential residence. He also met Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor, in her office for what he called a wide-ranging discussion. He also met President Bush for the first time in a small group discussion. What was Lewis's message at these meetings? Now, many weeds have grown up around this question. The usual view is that Lewis urged the Bush administration to shake up the Arab world, starting with the removal of Saddam Hussein. Terrorism was the outcome of tyranny. Invading Iraq and toppling Saddam would set off a chain reaction of freedom. The most dramatic version appeared in a Wall Street Journal article describing this as the Lewis Doctrine, the guiding idea behind the decision to invade. Lewis, in his memoirs, claimed that this was all nonsense. Here he is again. "The invasion of Iraq in 2003 is sometimes ascribed to my influence with Vice President Cheney, but the reverse is true. I did not recommend it. On the contrary, I opposed it." Now, Lewis claimed that instead he favored U.S. recognition of a free Iraq in the north of the country. According to Lewis, I quote him, "The liberation of Iraq could have been achieved far more peacefully and more effectively in this way than by a second war against Saddam Hussein. Simply to invade," he later said, "was the wrong way to do it. And I thought so and said so at the time. We should have supported the local regime, not made that unnecessary and pointless attack on Saddam Hussein's regime." End of quote. So where's the truth? I think it would be accurate to say that Lewis's views evolved. Now, in December 2001, on national television, he said something that aligned with his later claims. Asked about military intervention in Iraq, he pointed to the north of the country. There, Iraqis had what he called an organization which is capable, I believe, of forming a government and taking over. While some military force might be necessary, he added, I don't think that anything very extensive would be. But even as he dismissed the need for military force in public, he sat on a secret panel assembled at the behest of his old friend Paul Wolfowitz, who becomes Deputy Secretary of Defense. And this panel reached a rather different conclusion. Now, I have a copy of its unpublished recommendations entitled Delta of Terrorism. And Lewis clearly set much of the tone. The panel did urge that the U.S. back a free Iraq in the north, but also added this, and I quote, "We recommend dismantling the Iraqi regime as soon as possible. This will certainly require military action. Without minimizing the costs and risks of such action, we should bear in mind how easily we defeated Saddam in 1991. Now, according to journalist Bob Woodward, copies of these recommendations were hand-delivered to the cabinet, in some cases with a secret classification. Woodward said that the recommendations had a strong influence on Bush and that Condi Rice found them very, very persuasive. Now, that was the end of November 2001. That's not quite 3 months after 9/11. And the following year, Cheney and Chalabi began to reveal intelligence about Saddam's supposed weapons of mass destruction. And that rendered moot the idea of a free state in the north, because waiting, would be far too risky. Removing Saddam before he got these weapons became urgent, and Lewis came on board. In September 2002, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal under the headline, "Time for Toppling." He wrote that, and I quote, "A regime change may well be dangerous, but sometimes the dangers of inaction are greater than those of action." The danger of inaction, of course, was that Saddam would operationalize his weapons of mass destruction. As the invasion option gained momentum in the administration, Lewis's finely tuned statements fell more and more in line with it. The culmination came 3 days before the invasion of Iraq. Cheney appeared on the national news program, Meet the Press, and he invoked the authority of Lewis. And I quote, this is Cheney, "I firmly believe, along with men like Bernard Lewis, who was one of the great students of that part of the world, that strong, firm U.S. response to terror and threats to the United States would go a long way, frankly, towards calming things in that part of the world." So probably no mention of Lewis ever carried so far. And when the United States started bombing Baghdad 3 days later, his name was fresh in millions of minds as a super authority who'd given his stamp of approval to the war. Now, an interviewer once asked Lewis why he didn't give voice to his doubts in public once invasion became the policy. His answer, "I didn't feel at that crucial moment that it was right to take a public stance against the war." Now, that's what team members do. Once a decision is made, they stick to the program out of loyalty. Lewis had become so enmeshed in this process that he'd become a part of the team. But that is a far cry from saying he inspired the war. A journalist asked Lewis's friend Fuad Ajami about Lewis's influence, and Ajami's curt reply was, "Academics don't lead governments to war." And they don't. But Lewis's enemies, of course, especially in the academy, made just that claim, and in some quarters it stuck. In 2006, the Bush administration rewarded Lewis. Cheney personally came to speak warm words at his 90th birthday party, and both Lewis and Ajami received the National Humanities Medal from President Bush in the Oval Office. But Lewis's reputation had suffered a blow, and he knew it, and tried to mitigate it in his memoirs. But for many, his memory remains intertwined with the Iraq War. His obituary in the New York Times noted that Lewis, quote, "was widely perceived to have beaten the drum for war." And that perception, I think, is unlikely to change. Now, the story I tell might have ended here. In 2006, when this happened, Lewis had turned 90 years old. He'd been honored by the president and the vice president, but the stars in Washington no longer aligned for him. Bush sidelined his ailing Cheney in the second term, in Lewis's view to the detriment of U.S. policy and interests, and nearly all of Lewis's old friends, including Pearl and Wolfowitz, left office under the cloud of Iraq. But a couple of leaders still opened their doors to Lewis. The first case can only be considered bizarre, and the second, possibly consequential. First, the bizarre. In 2006, Lewis paid an unlikely visit to the brotherly leader of the great socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, Muammar Gaddafi. At the time, Gaddafi was on a charm offensive. After witnessing the fate of Saddam, he was eager to make up with the US, and a public relations firm in Libyan pay decided it would be a smart idea to invite prominent intellectuals to see the country and even to meet the leader. Now, many celebrity thinkers accepted the invitation. They included Harvard professors Joseph Nye, Robert Putnam, Steve Walt, and big think intellectuals, Benjamin Barber, Frank Fukuyama, and Anthony Giddens. Lewis also got an invitation. He was suspicious, as he put it, wondering what on earth Gaddafi could be wanting from me. But he did a little checking and decided to accept, although he declined the $15,000 honorarium. The Libyans arranged to fly him via London to Tripoli, and they put him up on the top floor of Tripoli's swankiest hotel. The next day, they whisk off Lewis to meet the leader. As Lewis recalled, and I quote him, "The journey to the meeting took place in several stages. First, a 30-minute drive to a small airport, then a flight into the desert, followed by a drive to a camp where the Libyan leader was awaiting us in his tent." So once again, Lewis found himself cast in the role of a messenger. Gaddafi's main message, Lewis recalled, and I quote him, "that for which he had brought me to here and pass on to Washington, was something of a surprise. You are all worried about Iran. You are quite wrong. Iran is not important and is not a real danger. The real danger, the source of all your troubles, of all the terrorism, of all the radical violence, is Saudi Arabia." That was the message. Now, Lewis purported to be surprised, but I suspect he'd been handpicked to convey this message, because he would be sympathetic to it. Only a few months before the Libya trip, at a high-profile forum in Washington, he traced the idea of suicide murder for Islam not to the Iranians, but to the Wahhabis. I quote him, this is Lewis, "Like so much else of what has gone wrong with Islam, we can trace it quite specifically to Wahhabism. Wahhabism is about as central to Islam as, shall we say, the Ku Klux Klan to Christianity." All right. So the PR firm had done its homework. They had reason to hope that Lewis wouldn't just convey the message, right? But he would amplify it. Lewis's next stop after Libya was here in Israel, and here he briefed the U.S. ambassador and his staff. Now, of course, Gaddafi's investment in Lewis and in the others didn't do him much good when his own people rose up against him. When he was overthrown and killed in 2011, his personal library was found to include some of Lewis's books. I promised to bring you back to Jerusalem before finishing, and I'll do that by quoting a statement issued in Jerusalem when Lewis died. It came from Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the statement went as follows. "Bernard Lewis was one of the great scholars of Islam and the Middle East in our time. I will always feel privileged to have witnessed firsthand his extraordinary erudition, and I gleaned invaluable insights from our many meetings over the years." Now, Lewis doesn't mention any of this in his memoirs, but some of it can be pieced together. Lewis and Netanyahu first met when Netanyahu was an unknown in connection with the Jonathan Institute, named after Bibi's older brother, who was killed in the Entebbe operation. The Institute held a high-profile conference on terrorism in Washington in 1984, and Lewis headlined a panel. He gave an address on Islamic terrorism, ? And it appeared in the volume edited by Netanyahu. Lewis's contribution was indeed erudite, ranged from the medieval assassins up to the present day. But it took a while for Lewis to warm to Netanyahu. He more naturally aligned with Shimon Peres. Lewis was on the White House lawn when Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shook hands, and he called that moment truly wonderful. After Rabin's murder, Peres served briefly as prime minister, and he came to a conference at this university to deliver an accolade to Lewis on his 80th birthday. Here's a photograph of that. But only a few days before that birthday celebration, Netanyahu had defeated Peres in an election and then became prime minister for the first time. I was director of the Dayan Center in that year, and when Lewis paid his customary visit to Israel, someone proposed that Lewis have a personal meeting with Netanyahu at the prime minister's office. So I arranged it through a friend who worked there, and I accompanied Lewis to the meeting, which took place after hours. I wish I could recall what was said, but I made no record, which is very poor form for a historian. I don't even remember the main issues of the day. My general recollection is that Netanyahu showed deference to Lewis and asked smart questions, much like a star student. There would be other meetings, especially once Lewis began to speak and write about Iran's nuclear program. In the summer of 2006, he wrote a piece claiming that Iran couldn't be deterred if it got nuclear weapons. Iran's leaders, above all its new president, Ahmadinejad, believed that the end time, the apocalyptic end time had come, and the Iranians would welcome a nuclear exchange with Israel, even if it meant their own destruction. For Iran, Lewis wrote, MAD, that's mutual assured destruction, is not a constraint, it is an inducement. Now this controversial thesis resonated very strongly with Netanyahu, who at the time was again leader of the opposition. And when Lewis visited Israel that winter, Netanyahu met with him in a private dining room at the Knesset. Naftali Bennett had just entered politics. He was Netanyahu's chief of staff. And he recalled the meeting in these words. Netanyahu was incisive. He kept asking Lewis questions. He listened as never before. This was a man on a mission, Netanyahu, to prevent a second Holocaust. Now, Lewis's proposed solution was to sideline Ahmadinejad. The man was the problem. The following April, Netanyahu met at the Knesset with the chair of the Senate, U.S. Senate Middle East Subcommittee. We have the American memo from WikiLeaks. Netanyahu urged that measures be taken to weaken Ahmadinejad by strengthening his rivals. And I quote from the memo, Netanyahu said he had consulted with noted historian Vernon Lewis, who believed that Iran would be less dangerous once Ahmadinejad was removed. Netanyahu now had an academic authority on whom he could rely. In 2012, Netanyahu, now prime minister, invoked Lewis from the podium of the UN General Assembly. He hailed Bernard as a great scholar and added, and I quote him, Iran's apocalyptic leaders believe that a medieval holy man will reappear in the wake of a devastating holy war. That's not just what they believe, that's what is actually guiding their policies, end of quote. Now, when Lewis made this claim, he was 90. And those who knew him in this last phase realized that he spoke increasingly in a prophetic register. MAD, mutual assured destruction, as an inducement, was less an evidence-based analysis of Iranian thinking and more a clarion call to the West to repent its tilt to appeasement. But whatever the case, the inducement quote lingers over the Iran debate. In 2014, a freshman congressman named Ron DeSantis repeated it in a committee hearing while describing Lewis as one of the most knowledgeable historians of Islamic thinking. Who knows, then, what might yet sprout from this seed? I come to my conclusion. What can we draw from these interactions? Lewis wasn't a diplomat or a policymaker by profession, and he didn't do a stint in government, except for his brief service during the war. That being so, the range of his encounters with world leaders is astonishing. It attests to many things: his academic reputation, his personal charm, his skills as a conversationalist, his trustworthiness. One would have to look hard to find a scholar with similar reach in high places and across so many countries. It's even more remarkable when one recalls that much of his engagement in politics came at a time in his life when most scholars have retired to genteel irrelevance. Remember that much of the academy had left Lewis behind as it spun leftwards. But in the realm of politics, he found appreciative audiences for his ideas among leaders who viewed him as a venerable sage, someone who offered pearls of wisdom retrieved from the depths of history. Now, these interactions didn't alter the course of events in any demonstrable way. They didn't prevent war in 1973 or prompt war in 2003, nor did Lewis ever claim that his analysis and advice had a measurable effect. You know, the policy world is full of boastful people who take more credit than they deserve for events. Lewis never did, and in many cases never even mentioned his meetings. If so, then how should we interpret Lewis's meetings with leaders? Were they insignificant encounters? And is this an insignificant lecture? After all, Lewis's great contribution lay in the realm of ideas. Here he had a profound effect, first in the world of scholarship, and later in the public sphere. The impact of the West, the return of Islam, the clash of civilizations, the new anti-Semitism, each idea transformed our understanding of the past and the present. In comparison, weren't his meetings with leaders just ephemera? The political background noise to a career of ideas and scholarship? To a large extent, that's true, but I think that approach misses an important point. The world of ideas is a marketplace. An almost unlimited number of ideas compete for this very limited attention of a distracted public. Why do some ideas prevail over others and come to be considered important? Now, there are lots of reasons. The coherence of an idea matters. So does its author's timing. But one reason is that some ideas and their champions win endorsements. And when we see that some idea makers are consulted by the powerful, we want to know more about those ideas. A prime example of this is Edward Saeed, Lewis's nemesis. What put Saeed on the map in the 80s wasn't just the merit of his ideas, and Lewis, for the record, thought they had no merit. It was the belief that Saeed served as an informal policy advisor to the elusive Yasser Arafat, that he carried messages to him from Secretaries of State Cyrus Vance and George Shultz, that he was a back channel with easy access to the PLO in Tunis. He was a member of the Palestine National Council. New York Magazine once ran a profile of Saeed under the headline, "Arafat's Man in New York, the Divided Life of Columbia Professor Edward Saeed." So the intellectual who leads such a divided life can use the mystique of politics to amplify his ideas, to rise above this cacophony of opinion pieces and media reportage. Many people thought they must read Saeed and Lewis because powerful people were consulting them behind closed doors. For both Saeed and Lewis, the meetings with Arafat or Cheney, the advising and the back channeling, were a means to an end. Now let's leave Saeed aside and ask what Lewis wanted. As I've argued on other occasions, Lewis wanted the Middle East to change and to prosper, to become a seat of democracy and peace. He'd grown up in a world of Hitler and Stalin. He'd participated in victory in the World War and did his bit intellectually in the Cold War. Washington's power, properly applied, had created a Pax Americana almost everywhere. And it could do so again in the Islamic world, to which he devoted his own life. Since America, stranger to the Middle East, knew so little, Lewis sought to enlighten it. Whatever one might say about this mission, it has to be stated forthrightly that Bernard Lewis was an idealist. And that, I submit, is what made him appealing to leaders in the first place. He represented not a government and its interests, but a civilization and its ideals. Middle Eastern leaders who sought harmony with Western civilization opened their doors to him. And so did American leaders who wanted to spread the West's values. Lewis didn't even have to knock. But we, as heirs, do have to knock on doors. In memorializing Bernard Lewis in these lectures, our aim should be to encourage young people to read his works. And there are compelling reasons to read them. The topics he addressed remain urgent. He assessed them with a clarity and an elegance that no one approximates today. But in this effort to keep him fresh and timely for the next generation, let's not neglect a great way to get our foot in the door. Let's remind them that Lewis was even more than a scholar. From the palaces of kings to the desert tents of dictators, from the Knesset to the Senate, from the Pentagon to the White House, the mighty invited Bernard Lewis in and asked him what he thought. You, young student, can also invite him in, just like they did. All you have to do is take that book down from your library shelf. Bernard Lewis is waiting for you. Thank you.